Najma Minhas with GVS Dialogue. I've been following the student protests in the United States keenly because I generally believe that protests are good for democracies. They act as signals that certain groups are not happy and that the government needs to think about what they're signaling. And that this is an important part of any flourishing democracy, and they act as a pressure cooker with a vent. They allow venting. So I tried reaching out to a couple of sociologists, but they didn't want to touch this particular issue with a barge pole, which I found often happens in the United States on anything related to Israel and Palestine. But it's a fascinating issue, and I did want to cover it because it not only involves the First Amendment in the United States Constitution, giving free students the right to free speech, but it also has what I see as geopolitical implications, the impact on the United States support for Israel in the long run. Please do share this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you enjoy the content of this channel. It will help me to bring more guests and give me your feedback on topics you are interested in seeing covered. This week, we've seen thousands of students protesting across the United States. They've been tear gassed, they've been beaten up, hundreds have been arrested. This is one of the largest, most significant student uprisings seen in the United States in the recent decades. On the other side, we've seen boomer leaders going up in arms, from Netanyahu, who declared that what was happening on US campuses as horrific and reminiscent of what happened in the German universities in the 1930s.
What's happening on America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable. It has to be stopped. It has to be condemned, and condemned unequivocally.
To Biden denouncing blatant anti-Semitism that has no place on college campuses.
You condemn the anti-Semitic protests on college campuses.
I condemn the anti-Semitic protests. That's why I've set up a program to deal with that.
To Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who went to Columbia University, along with some of the members of Congress, and lectured the protesters on being lawless agitators, and called at the university president to resign if she couldn't control her students, and even suggested that the National Guards across the nation be brought in to quell the protests.
I'm here today joining my colleagues and calling on President Shafiq to resign if she cannot immediately bring order to this chaos.
Now they want to give more grace and allow the students time to, govern and control themselves. This needs to be stamped out. And if they can't get control of it on the university campus, there is an appropriate time for the National Guard to be involved.
While social media and TV channels were busy covering these student protests and arrests and fighting with armed forces for the last couple of days, convenient you may say, as they then had enough interesting footage to cover their bulletins for audiences and didn't need to cover extensively the revelations that came to light of a mass grave found in the Naser Hospital in Gaza, where bodies of over 400 people were found with their hands and legs tied together, which the IDS has denied. But under the ICC statute, it is a war crime to kill or wound a combatant in custody, and the tying of their hands and legs would suggest that these were not active combatants. The UN Human Rights Agency has asked for an independent investigation, but during this whole time there hasn't been a peep from the Muslim world. No students have come out on their campuses, and definitely no leader has come out to condemn. Student protests started since October last year, and they've been ongoing in different shapes and forms, mostly in response to what these students see as a hideous and indiscriminate violence displayed by the Israeli government to the Palestinians. And not because they're anti-Semitic, and not because they're left-wingers being financed by George Soros, as is being claimed in social media, who, by the way, is Jewish himself. Brown University students in February this year held an 8-day hunger strike, but these latest protests started after Columbia University students set up tents after the Egyptian-born President Minhas Shafiq went to Congress hearing and suggested retribution and the curtailing of academic freedoms for those speaking on Palestine or being anti-Semitic, with all the broad set of what now comes under this term.
I share with you your repugnance at those remarks. I completely understand that. On my watch, faculty who make remarks that cross the line in terms of anti-Semitism, there will be consequences.
Columbia students for months had now been asking their university to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, close down its Tel Aviv campus, and divest its huge $13 billion endowment fund from Israeli companies. The university has just responded with heavy-handed tactics and in the end called in the NYPD, the first time in 30 years that the police have come in to break up student protests. This was the immediate flame that lit students across the country who came out and started setting up tents in their own universities. So far, universities in over 16 states and Washington, D.C. have been affected, and it seems to be spreading like a wildfire. None of this is new. Columbia students have a history of political activism. They set up encampments in 1968 to protest against the Vietnam War, and in 1985 against apartheid South Africa. The Brown University students held several hunger strikes in the 1980s to protest against South African apartheid. And during the boycott, divest and sanctions, what is called the BDS movement against South Africa, over 150 American colleges in total divested. In fact, Columbia University was amongst the first universities to divest from South Africa. And these at the time were tough monetary decisions for the universities involved. At this point in the 1980s, between 1/3 to 1/2 of the S&P 500 companies did business with South Africa. And these companies were among the best investments at the time. They were blue chip companies, they were steady earners that were essential to the growth of endowment funds. The same argument is currently being made about Israeli technology and pharmaceutical sectors being involved in the latest advances in these sectors, among others. So how could these college endowment funds, which give scholarships to poor students, among other things, they would be affected? However, even more importantly, in the case of divesting from Israel, the Anti-Defamation League, a Jewish NGO, has said to ask for BDS demands on Israel are basically anti-Semitic, and since that would result in the eradication of the world's only Jewish state. And being called anti-Semitic frightens everyone, and so it should if they were being anti-Semitic. But this has left the movement in a limbo since it first started in 2006. But the divest investment movement in South Africa was not a success overnight either. It took decades of time to achieve what actually achieved right now. On Prime Minister Netanyahu's claim that what is happening on the US college campuses is anti-Semitic, well, he's been called out by the Jewish Senator Bernie Sanders.
No, Mr. Netanyahu, it is not anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas to point out that in a little over 6 months, your extremist government has killed 34,000 Palestinians and wounded more than 78,000, 70% of whom are women and children.
Even more ironically, Netanyahu faces increasing numbers of protests against him in his own country. Thousands of protesters have come out in the past couple of weeks asking him to resign and hold new elections. They're not happy with his policies, and in particular, his government is seen not to be working for getting the hostages released.
The government is doing horrendous things in Gaza, not in our name, and we want the government to take responsibility and resign today, right now.
It's also clear what is happening to these students will not help Israel in the long run. They're not going to forget what they went through, and the perceived injustice that was done to them will stay with them. And these are Ivy Leaguers. They're from the top schools around the country. Students who will go into the top jobs in the city, in corporates, and state and federal government. A Pew study done in February showed that only around a quarter of Americans under 30 have a favorable view of the Israeli government, and this is compared to a half of more of those over 50 age. What does not bode well for Israel, or even more, is that a larger percentage, 34% of those below 30, believe that Hamas had valid reason to do what it did, as compared to 17% over 50s. And by that, they're referring to the 70 years of occupation by Israel. It is the largest recipient of USAID. Close to $300 billion has gone to Israel, and military aid in particular has been an important part of that. But the recent Pew survey shows that those below 30 do not favor so much military aid going to Israel, at 7% versus 25% of those over 50 who strongly favor military aid for Israel as part of this particular war against Hamas. And I will put a link to that article in the description below because it's very interesting to read. Now, this whole youth dynamics is also compounded by the changing composition of the US demographics. As immigration and childbirth increases the non-white population in the United States, and they're less sympathetic to the Israeli point of view. Witness only recently the number of Latin American countries that either recall their ambassadors from Israel or severely condemn the Israeli actions.
Sabe o que está acontecendo na faixa de Gaza com o povo palestino? Não existe nenhum outro momento histórico Aliás, existiu quando Hitler resolveu matar os judeus.
The people and government of Bolivia has taken the decision to break diplomatic ties from today with the state of Israel.
These changing dynamics and how they're impacting the United States was picked up by the late Samuel Huntington in his very controversial book at the time, Who Are We? US students have a history of protests and see themselves as speaking truth to power as part of their exercising of the First Amendment, the right to free speech, which is an essential prerequisite of being a liberal democracy. They see calls of being anti-Semitic as just being weaponized against them and claim that a few bad actors who may have done so should not discount their whole movement. And in addition, large numbers of Jewish people and groups are playing an active part in these protests. Had these protests been happening anywhere else in the world, had we been seeing these scenes anywhere else in the world, particularly had it been China or Russia, by now US officials would have released several statements on the heavy-handedness of officials, the violation of human rights, and the importance of free speeches.
Our message to peaceful protesters around the world is the same and consistent. People should be allowed the right to assemble and to peacefully protest policies or laws or dictates that they take issue with. We're watching this closely, as you might expect we would. And again, we continue to stand up and support the right of peaceful protest. And I think we're going to watch this closely and we'll see where things go.
These students are now coming back to university surrounded by civil rights groups and lawyers contesting what happened to them should not have been allowed. On the domestic front, it's election year, and young voters are also crucial for President Biden's re-election chances. In 2020, they were vital in deciding which camp the close call Pennsylvania state went to. Ultimately, it was won by President Biden by a really narrow margin of 1.17%. Currently, he's still ahead of the former President Trump in terms of support from young voters, standing at 50% to 37%. But this lead has gone down significantly from where he stood in 2020. And given the fact that he barely scraped enough electoral college votes to get voted as president, these voters are essential for him. Also, what's becoming interesting about these student movements is how they've been hijacked by the right wing in the United States to take out all their grievances on the direction society's going. It's also become ostensibly a part of the old culture wars between the right and the left in the United States. And the right wing in the country are using it as a tool to attack what is called the DEI movement, the diversity, equity and inclusion, what they call the woke movement, which has gone too far to the left. And they see universities as the bedrock of this. University students everywhere are bastions of progressive ideas, but the students' protest movement has to be seen in light of what it is, which is playing their role in a participatory democracy, where the right to peaceful assembly and the freedom of speech is essential. Antony Blinken himself recently, remarking on these student protests, said, "It's a hallmark of our democracy that our citizens make their views known, their concerns, their anger at any given time." And I think that reflects on the strength of the country, the strength of democracy.
And in our own country, it's a hallmark of our democracy that our citizens make known their views, their concerns, their anger at any given time. And I think that reflects the strength of the country, the strength of democracy.
He is right. The reputation of American democracy is on the stand here, but so far it's failing.